Kathleen.
Hello, Mr. Madigan. Um, okay, so let me start off. My name's Kathleen Starhall, and we're here with Walt Madigan, author of A Day in the Life. How are you today, sir?
Oh, I'm fine.
Great. Now, first, I do want to say thank you for your service. I'm prior Navy, so I completely get it. As he had stated, first question I have for you is, since you were drafted into the Army at such a young age during that time, how did you initially cope with transitioning from civilian life to military life?
Well, I was drafted into the U.S. Army at the age of 18. I turned 19 by the time I was sworn in. My transition from civilian life to military life was probably easier than most men in my basic training company at Fort Bliss, Texas. I had just completed 4 years of high school at a Catholic all-male college preparatory institution in Hollywood. The Dominican priests who ran the show were very strict disciplinarians, not unlike the drill sergeants at Fort Bliss. In a way, my 12 years of Catholic education, 8 years of very iron-handed nuns, and 4 years of rigorous Dominican priests inadvertently acted as a precursor to life in the military. I had an excellent educational background, which helped me stay laser-focused on military drills, such as learning to clean, break down, and shoot the rifle issued to me, an M14. Also, the night infiltration course, where we low-crawled across a field replete with logs and shallow swamps as live gunfire was buzzing overhead. A preview of what awaited me in the jungles of Vietnam if I would eventually become a combat infantryman. As a side note to my Catholic education, when I reported to the building in Los Angeles where I was inducted in August '66, we were given a series of short IQ tests after being sworn in. I found out later this testing was a way to classify you as far as intelligence goes, with Class 1 being the smartest and Class 5, well, not the brightest bulb in the pack. During my first week of basic training, I was called into the captain of our basic training office along with 5 other recruits. The captain informed us all we were rated Class 1, and he thought we might be interested in attending West Point. It was a 1-year program. If you did well, you would go on to West Point as a freshman. I started doing the math in my head. Let's see, 2 months of basic training, 12 months in Virginia, a total of 14 months. Then after Virginia, I'd flip the bird at the Army and tell them I was not interested in West Point, and I would only have 10 months of active duty left. Hence, I wouldn't go to Vietnam. I could tell that recruits were thinking the same thing as me. We were all deathly afraid of going to Vietnam and being mortally wounded. So we all informed the captain, go ahead, sign us up. At the end of our 8-week basic training stint, our MOS, military specialty occupation, orders were posted on the bulletin board outside the captain's office, and I was utterly shocked to see that mine, along with the other Class 1 recruits, was 11 Bravo, light weapons infantry, and we'd be reporting to Tigerland of Fort Polk, Louisiana in a few days. The captain had the courtesy to call all 6 of us back into his office and told us West Point Preparatory School was off the table, and then informed us that the Army was changing its strategy and now would assign all the smart guys 11 Bravo, which meant you would be given a one-way ticket to the jungles of Vietnam with no return ticket guaranteed.
Okay,
So I hope that answers your question.
yeah. Now, in A Day in the Life, it blends moments of levity with intense experiences. How did you manage to balance the lighthearted anecdotes with the harsh realities in your writing?
Well, I'd always been somewhat of a class clown during my time in parochial school, much to the chagrin of the nuns running the show. This behavior carried over into high school, and I often found myself sitting in detention at the end of the day. But as a combat infantryman in Vietnam in early '67 with the 1st Cavalry Division, I would often try and inject a bit of humor into the minds of other soldiers, even though we are constantly embedded in firefights with the enemy on a daily basis. I almost felt it was a necessity to share lighthearted anecdotes with my fellow grunts in order to maintain a modicum of sanity among the horrors of this insane war. A Day in the Life is not just another Vietnam War memoir. It is a testament to becoming resilient, mentally alert, and keeping a sense of humor against the backdrop of an ugly war and day-to-day pain, discomfort, and frustration. While writing the memoir, it was important for me to intersperse the chapters with passages of my earlier life growing up in the urban sprawl of Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Lots of humor added here, such as family funnies, Catholic school antics, and the emerging surf culture in the early 60s. I felt it was important for the reader to get a glimpse of what my past life had been like before I suddenly found myself humping a ruck in the hot, humid jungles of Vietnam and trying to stay alive on a day-to-day basis.
What was the most difficult part about writing this memoir, and how did you push through it?
Yes, probably the most difficult part of writing my memoir was visualizing and reliving the memories of fellow soldiers who were killed or severely wounded on the battlefields of Vietnam. Most of these men were my age, 19, and would never return to a normal life back in the States, or the world, as we often called it. I thought of the men who lay on the jungle floor after a fierce firefight and clutched their stomachs to keep their intestines from spilling out on the jungle floor. Some cried out for their mothers before dying amidst the chaos. These men who died on the jungle floors of Vietnam would never marry, have children of their own, watch their sons and daughters grow up and prepare for their high school proms. Sometimes I'd be consumed with anger thinking about the gutless politicians such as LBJ or a Secretary of War, Robert McNamara. The war had nothing to do with freedom. It was all about control. I would soon learn after being in country for a few weeks that most Vietnamese people were sympathetic to communist rule and they wanted to be independent. This fell on deaf ears to politicians in Washington, especially LBJ. And by the time I arrived in February '67, there were over 500,000 young men deployed to Vietnam to fight in a war they wanted no part of. I also found it hard to write about some of the more seriously injured soldiers I would encounter while assisting Lieutenant Coleman, the doctor and night CQ of my ward at the 106 Army Hospital in Yokohama. Many of these soldiers were missing limbs. Many had colonoscopy bags attached to their stomachs. They would lie prone in their beds with vacant and hopeless looks on their faces as they just stared up at the ceiling fans overhead. Perhaps the hardest experience to relive were my memories of assisting Lieutenant Coleman one night in the burn ward located on the second floor of our building. Upon entering the ward, my senses were assaulted by the smell, not unlike that of rotting meat. Many of these poor souls were covered in gauze from head to toe, with 2 holes for their eyes, a hole for their nose, to breathe properly, and a larger hole for their mouth. For lack of a better description, the ward resembled the set of a Hollywood mummy film from the 30s.
Wow. Now, revisiting those traumatic experiences can be indeed incredibly challenging. How did you write about your wounds and recovery impact your healing process, both physically and emotionally?
Okay, well, revisiting the traumatic experiences of being wounded twice during my first 2 months in Vietnam was both physically and emotionally challenging. While writing, I would often repeat a mantra to myself, a mantra we said as soldiers when things became very grim in the jungle. Fuck it, man, don't mean nothing, drive on. The first wound was minor, maybe a square 1-inch hole in my upper left thigh, and required only 12 stitches back at base camp in Fayette. I was in good shape by then, probably 15 pounds lighter than the day I entered the Army, and recovered quickly, and was soon sent back into the bush with Charlie Company. However, the emotional part of that experience set in after our medic specialist, Angel Martinez, injected a syringe of morphine into my thigh. As the morphine began coursing through my veins, I became very sad and asked specialist Martinez if he thought they'd be able to save my leg. Wrong question, I soon found out as he got in my face and screamed. Listen here, you dumb cherry fuck. Ain't nothing wrong with you. Probably a bark ricochet from the teak tree hit your leg. Oh yeah, they'll probably load you up on the incoming resupply choppers along with those 4 dead gooks. They'll take you back to the field hospital in Fayette, put a few stitches in your thigh, and then put your sorry ass on light duty for a few days. The morphine was still taking effect, and I felt the emotion of joy thinking I passed the first test of being a combat soldier, and the fact that I was heading back to base camp soon, and maybe even sleep in a real bed with clean sheets for a few days, and eat real food, not sea rations. The second time I was wounded was a real game changer. I had taken a large chunk of enemy shrapnel in my upper left hip buttock area and smaller fragments in my lower extremities. The result of an MVA ambush. I was flown to the 8th Field Hospital in Nha Trang to remove the fragments. The next day after the operation, 2 nurses came to my bedside and began changing out the dressings, one nurse unraveling the bloody gauze and the other squirting a saline solution to help unstick the dressing. The large, ugly hole in my hip was fastened together with wire stitches and hurt like hell, and I was an emotional mess. I was overcome with depression, thinking I'd probably be limping the rest of my life, maybe with the use of a cane. I was only 19. But all that changed when the officer who operated on me came by the bedside as the nurses were changing out the dressings. He looked at the hole in my hip and said, I know that looks ugly, Private Madigan, but that is the cleanest $1 million wound I have ever operated on. Yes, the fragments went in deep, but miraculously did not sever any major artery groups or any bone damage. In the meantime, you'll be playing grab ass with military nurses in the Philippines and Japan. Both nurses stopped and rolled their eyes at his pronouncement. His words flooded me with an immediate sense of relief and filled me with the resolve to heal properly. It was the first time I heard I would be transported to the Philippines, Clark Air Force Base, and then on to Japan, to the 106 Army Hospital in Yokohama.
So that's a lot going on. Your memoir delves deep into your faith and its role in your survival. Can you discuss a specific moment from all that you've written about during your time in Vietnam where you believe your faith was tested the most?
Yes. On the day I departed Los Angeles for Vietnam, my mother presented me with a rosary. It was blessed by a close Monsignor friend, Father Donnelly. My faith in God got me through some tough times in Vietnam. I remember being out on night ambush patrol, sitting on my 2-hour watch in the inky darkness, one hand on the clicker of my Claymore mine, and the other holding my rosary. I'd pray the rosary during my 2-hour watch, asking God to protect me and my fellow soldiers in Charlie Company. There was a specific moment where my faith in God was severely tested. This was my last day of combat when my company walked into an NVA ambush just outside the city of Song Mao. I was wounded by enemy shrapnel and lay helpless on the jungle floor. My rifle was blown out of my hands from the impact of the Chi-Com, a Chinese-manufactured hand grenade. I started praying because I thought the end was near, but then I realized I still had 5 fragmentation grenades attached to my web gear. I remember my training at Tigerland and how to cook off a hand grenade. Every time I saw enemy muzzle fire coming from the tree line in front of me, I would pull the pin on the grenade, let the safety fly off, which started the charge, and count 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. The grenade would explode in 5 seconds. Then I pitched the grenade towards the tree line, and it would explode before the enemy had a chance to pitch it back. I continued with the other 4 grenades and felt like I took out at least 2 machine gun nests. I started feeling intense pain in my upper left hip buttock area and noticed my fatigue pants were drenched in blood. And that's when I realized I had taken several shards of shrapnel in my left hip and both legs. Then I pulled my rosary out and started making my peace with God, praying in active contrition before I passed out and died on the jungle floor. Halfway through my prayer, I heard a rustling sound behind me and was startled to see Sergeant Porter my platoon sergeant low crawling towards me. He grabbed the top of my web gear behind my neck and started dragging me back to safety behind a copse of teak trees. He whispered in my ear, "Hold on, Madigan. I'm going to drag your ass out of here." This experience was by far the biggest test of my faith in God, and I felt He came through for me. Father Bill, a chaplain assigned to our ward at the 106 Army Hospital in Yokohama, once told me as we were conducting our nightly rounds, "Life is a test," he said. "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." James 1:12. Remember that, son.
Yeah. Now, the Vietnam War has been depicted in many different lights. How does your portrayal of the war compare to other well-known accounts, such as in Platoon or Born on the 4th of July?
Okay, just shutting my phone off. My portrayal of experiences as a combat infantryman in Vietnam is reminiscent of cinematic classics such as Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, and We Were Soldiers, especially the depictions of fierce, bloody firefights with the Viet Cong and enemy NVA soldiers. The ambush Charlie Company encountered in Song Mao was pretty much the same terrible experience that Oliver Stone portrayed midway through his masterpiece, Platoon. His film is autobiographical since Stone's company in the 25th Infantry walked into a U-shaped ambush in early January '68. Like myself, Stone was wounded that day and earned his second Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. I also have 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. Another classic Vietnam War film that resonated with me was We Were Soldiers. On November 14, 1965, Colonel Hal Moore led his 450-man 1st and 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, in an audacious air assault deep into enemy-controlled territory in the Ai Drang Valley of South Vietnam's Central Highlands. The fierce firefights that ensued were remindful of my own combat experience as a member of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. The film succeeds in making a portrait of war at its most inspiring and devastating. One scene that was evocative of my combat experience is the bombing raids that ensued when Colonel Moore called in an airstrike. The F-4 fighter bombers that showed up, dropping payloads of 250-pound bombs on the enemy, was a close approximation of my own experience when my company walked into an NVA ambush in early '67. We were badly outnumbered like Colonel Moore, and if those fast movers had not shown up, I wouldn't be writing this missive today. Just as the film portrays, the F-4 Phantom jets in our situation dropped their bombs with pinpoint accuracy and saved the lives of many soldiers, mine included.
Okay. Now, your memoir does include parts of the surf culture of Los Angeles where you grew up. How did that background influence your perspective and approach to the challenges you faced in Vietnam?
Yes, my background as a surfer while attending high school in the early '60s plays a big part in various chapters of my memoir. Charlie Company was composed of a scattering of soldiers from all parts of the United States. Eventually, I discovered that these men were fascinated with surfing stories of Southern California. Films like Gidget, Beach Party, and Beach Blanket Bingo helped foster the myth of the California surfer as some kind of Greek god. My status as a lowly, private, first class, and FNG, fucking new guy, with the 1st Cavalry Division was suddenly elevated when I put on a show for my fellow Boonie Rats at Little Buddha Beach after a grueling 10-day search and destroy mission. Little Buddha Beach was positioned parallel to our airstrip at LZ Betty in Fayette. At one point, I was about to hang 5 toes over the nose of my surfboard when I heard a huge roar to my rear and a blast of wind that almost blew me off the board. I looked up to see that I was being buzzed by 6 Huey gunship helicopters who were out on patrol, cruising over the junks and sampans off the coast of Fayette. I could almost reach up and touch the skid of the chopper above me when the door gunner swiveled his M60 machine gun mounted to the chopper. He leaned out and gave me the ubiquitous peace sign with his fingers and had a shit-eaten grin on his face. While acting as an aide to our ward doctor, Lieutenant Mark Coleman, at the 106 Army Hospital in Yokohama, I would often try and uplift the spirits of wounded soldiers by telling them the stories of my surfing experiences in high school. I soon discovered that many of these wounded warriors loved hearing stories of early surf culture in Los Angeles, and they would eventually goad me into describing the surfer babes. Lieutenant Coleman encouraged me to tell these stories to give these men hope and not to talk about the war as if it never existed.
Right.
In one chapter, I even tried to teach my physical therapist, Lieutenant Catherine Russell, how to do the surfer stomp, a song mentioned in the Beach Boys tune, Surfing USA. She had invited me back to her bungalow for dinner, and we were listening to Miserlou by Dick Dale and the Deltones. She could not stop laughing and told me it's the silliest dance she had ever seen.
Now, your memoir does touch on themes of grit and resilience. What message do you hope readers take away about facing adversity and finding strength in this kind of situation?
Yes, that's true. My memoir often touches on themes of grit and resilience. One thing I was very worried about, a time when I'd eventually encounter close contact with the enemy Vietnamese forces, is how I would react to the chaos of bullets whizzing over my head, or possibly being hit and killed in action. My biggest concern was that I might shrink and cower and hug the jungle floor and not return fire like my fellow soldiers in Charlie Company. This could simply not happen was my daily mantra. I often repeated it to myself. It would be a fate worse than death if I cowered in front of my fellow boonie rats in Charlie Company. So, as a combat infantryman about to enter the jungles of Vietnam, I often prayed to God to instill bravery in my heart and soul, and that I not become a coward on the battlefield when the proverbial shit hit the fan. Thankfully, that never happened, and I was even a little surprised at my course of action after being wounded by an enemy grenade, a Chi-Com, when my company walked into an MVA ambush outside the city of Song Mao. I thought about Father Bill's words to me that we are always being tested by God in one form or another. And now laying on the jungle floor and bleeding profusely from my left hip, buttock area, and my lower extremities, I was being tested in a most extreme manner. I felt the life draining out of me, but I still had 5 fragmentation grenades attached to my web gear, and instinctively my training from Tigerland kicked in. I remembered how to cook off a grenade, and every time I saw muzzle fire coming from the tree line 20 meters in front of me, I'd pull the pin on a grenade, let the handle fly off, which started the 5-second charge, and count 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and then throw the grenade toward the tree line and wait for the explosion. I did this with all 5 grenades and felt that I had taken out at least 2 enemy machine guns. On that day, I found strength in myself as a soldier and an ever-increasing faith in God, who I felt was listening to my prayers and guiding me to safety.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, how did your experience in Vietnam shape your views on life and death? How do those views reflect in your narrative?
The most transformative experience of my life occurred on the day I heard I was not returning to Vietnam, that in fact I'd be leaving the 106 Army Hospital in Yokohama later that day on a C-141 Starlifter medical transport plane and headed back to the States, to the world, to Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California. I will never forget the feeling of euphoria that coursed through my veins. The elation reached deep inside me, physically, emotionally, and into my very soul. Deep down, I knew if I returned to Vietnam after being wounded twice, I'd most certainly die, or at the very least be horribly wounded. Most combat soldiers serving in Vietnam would wake up every morning and think, is this the day I'm going to die? The specter of death hung like a shadow on every soldier who jumped off a helicopter and entered the jungle to confront the enemy. These views of life and death are reflected when I sat in the chapel attached to the 106 Army Hospital and had a personal conversation with God, thanking Him profusely for giving me my life back after I heard an hour or two earlier that I was returning to the States. I remember that day like it happened yesterday. I remember leaving the chapel and sitting in the tea garden adjacent to the hospital and looking out at Tokyo Bay and suddenly appreciating all the beauty in the world. When I found out I got my life back, I was looking out at the world with a new set of lens. I would be returning to the mainland on that very night, and now the world seemed full of possibilities. Another potent reminder that shaped my views on life and death occurred when I was recuperating after surgery after the 8th Field Hospital in Nha Trang. I was sitting outside on a patio having a smoke break with fellow soldier Randy Caswell. A large army truck with a black cross on the driver's door and the initials GR underneath pulled up to the building adjacent to the patio. We just sat there and watched as soldiers opened the back doors and unloaded zipped up body bags onto a large gurney. Then the soldiers wheeled the dead soldiers into the building to be prepared for the journey home to the U.S. The dead soldiers would be identified by their dog tags or maybe wallet identification. They'd clean up the bodies, embalm them, get tagged and bagged, and put them into 10 coffins. Next, they'd be shipped off to Tan Son Nhut Airport by Saigon, or as it was commonly referred to as the KIA Travel Bureau, where they'd be loaded up on Air Force cargo planes and flown back to the States to be claimed by their families for a funeral and proper burial. Randy, Kent, and I were thinking the same thing. That easily could have been us in those body bags. In the last chapter of my memoir, the sun had gone down, and I recall being back at the reassignment barracks, Building C, waiting for the medics to come and transfer me to Tashikawa Air Force Base. From there, I'd be loaded onto a C-141 Starlifter medical transport plane and flown back to Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California. I was going through my shaving bag to make sure everything was intact. I realized at that moment all the possessions I own could fit into that bag. A few razors, shaving cream, toothbrush, and assorted toiletries. My dog tags, a wallet I purchased at the commissary with my new military ID, a tattered copy of Goldfinger by Ian Fleming, my Purple Heart, and the rosary my mother gave me on the day I departed for Vietnam. It occurred to me that all of these items were replaceable, but the one thing that was not replaceable was the greatest gift that God had bestowed upon me, my life.
Now, you choose to tell your story in snapshot scenes. What influenced this narrative style? How do you think it affects the reader's engagement with your story?
Well, I chose to tell my story, a day in the life, in snapshot scenes. I use this narrative style to provide the reader a sense of intimacy and immediacy. I drew inspiration from memories that often appeared in flashes, fragments and vivid forms, such as the rainbow arcing over Tokyo Bay, or the vivid description of the Japanese tea garden, which sat adjacent to the Catholic chapel of the 106 Army Hospital. By structuring my memoir in this form, I wanted to replicate these experiences for the reader, making him feel like he was reliving these moments with me. When I was providing rough drafts to my editor, she informed me one of my biggest strengths as a writer was show me, don't tell me. She then provided a quote from Russian playwright Anton Chekhov. Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. When I discovered I'd be leaving Japan for the States and not returning to Vietnam, I wanted the reader to experience the ineffable joy coursing through my veins. I immediately grabbed my rosary from my shaving bag and headed for the chapel connected to the hospital. I'd then write. My heart felt as though it could burst from my chest. It was like being reborn. I never thought it was possible to feel a euphoria that elevated my whole being, as if it had reached inside me physically, emotionally, and into my soul. After finding out that God had given me my life back, I was suddenly flooded with memories of my past and all the experiences that led up to this glorious moment in time. Hence, the narrative becomes interspersed with Catholic school antics, early surf culture in Los Angeles, and family funnies.
Okay, now the memoir blends personal memory with broader historical events. How did you navigate the line between your personal recollection and historical accuracy in the book? Was that
Well, in a
something
few
easy to
chapters
do?
of my memoir, I blend memory with historical events indeed. I often use search engines on the internet, a large coffee table book titled Smithsonian, the Vietnam War. I wanted to be accurate with dates, times, and certain cities in Vietnam during my combat experience. For example, the distance between my base camp, LZ Betty in Van Thiet, and our new base of operations in April 67 at Song Mao, a town 56 kilometers northeast of Van Thiet. Also, the location of Little Buddha Beach below the cliffs of LZ Betty, and my in-country training in An Khe, the base of operations for the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. One broader historical event I discussed briefly is the French colonization of Vietnam that lasted for 6 decades. I discuss this because the French had built the airstrip at LZ Betty in the 1950s. They began colonizing Vietnam in the 1880s, but met with disaster when the French-held garrison at Dien Bien Phu fell in 1954 after a 4-month siege by Vietnamese nationalists Ho Chi Minh. The French pulled out of Vietnam shortly thereafter. I also felt it was important to provide a brief history of the 7th Cavalry, who was nicknamed Gary Owen for an Irish jig that can be traced back to the 1860s. The 7th Cavalry dates to a time before George Armstrong Custer's regiment that was wiped out in the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June of 1876. Leap forward, and it was the same 7th Cavalry. However, instead of horses as a primary method of transportation to battle, we used helicopters, hence the attached designation Air Mobile to our infantry division. In Chapter 17, Little Buddha, I mentioned the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons in August 1945, towns approximately 400 miles southwest of Yokohama. I was feeding koi fish in a pond with 2 Japanese groundsmen at the tea garden adjacent to the 106 Army Hospital. These 2 kindred souls harbored no animosity towards me, an American, and they invited me to their afternoon ritual of throwing bread on the waters. Another transformative experience that happened on that amazing day.
Okay. Now, how do you see your experiences in the book resonating with today's readers, especially those who don't have a direct connection to the Vietnam War?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
How do you see your experiences in the book resonating with today's readers, especially those who may not have a direct connection to the Vietnam War?
I feel my memoir on the Vietnam War will resonate with readers because it deals with the harsh realities of war, whether it's World War II, the Korean War, or the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I wanted the reader to experience what combat was like through my lens, so to speak, to know what it felt like to experience a fusillade of ear-deafening gunfire just inches above my head, or to experience the earth-shaking roar of an F-4 Phantom jet flying 30 meters above my position and unleashing a cluster of 250-pound bombs. The Vietnam War still resonates with today's readers as it is often depicted in classic films like Forrest Gump and Apocalypse Now. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington is the most visited memorial in the National Mall. Today, decades after the war, the American people remain deeply divided over the conflict's meaning. I felt it was important for a young man, say 18 or 19, to read my story before signing up with the military, especially with the Marines. My hope is that the young man will get a sense of what he may encounter in combat before he gets sent off halfway around the globe, to fight in a war, to protect democracy at home. And when it comes time for that man to vote for congressman, senator, or president, he won't be lured into voting for the types of gutless politicians who sent over 500,000 young men to Vietnam, a futile war that we lost in a country that we also abandoned in 1975.
Now, your faith did play a significant role in your journey. How has your relationship with your faith evolved since your time in Vietnam, and how is it reflected in your memoir?
I see my memoir contributing to a reader's sense of history regarding the Vietnam War, and hopefully that reader learns something from this history. A war the U.S. should never have been involved in. Yes, we had superior conventional weapons, but they were ineffective against a country that was not industrialized and an enemy that employed guerrilla tactics and used the dense jungle as cover. I was in country less than a month when I realized the U.S. was not going to win this war. Charlie Company was consistently sent on patrols to draw the enemy out, whether they be the Viet Cong or NVA soldiers. Hence, U.S. soldiers were used as bait to draw out enemy and would walk into enemy ambushes on a daily basis. The U.S. used all its military forces and still failed to force North Vietnam its intention to conquer South Vietnam. The two Vietnams were eventually reunited.
Okay, so can you discuss the themes of healing and resilience as portrayed in the book, and how does your journey provide insights into the process of overcoming trauma and rebuilding one's life?
Well, my faith in God played a significant role in combat experiences in Vietnam. I guess everyone has heard the old adage, no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. Eventually I found out there's a lot of truth to that saying. When I left for Vietnam, my mother presented me with a rosary and told me that Father Donnelly, a family friend, had Bishop Timothy Manning bless the rosary. That rosary was always with me, and when I went on search and destroy missions, I always carried it in the top pocket of my fatigue shirt for quick access. I remember pulling it out when it came time for my watch on night ambush patrol. I had long conversations with God, asking Him to protect me and my fellow grunts in Charlie Company. I wasn't a particularly religious soldier, but that all changed when I started going on combat missions in Vietnam.
Okay, so final question, and I want to thank you for your time. Are there any future writing projects or other endeavors you're currently working on or planning?
Yes, future writing projects is a follow-up memoir titled Journey to Esalen. It begins where a day in the life ends, as a C-141 Starlifter medical plane touches down on the tarmac at the Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California. The book follows my journey from Travis Air Force Base to the hospital at Fort Ord, California, and my eventual recovery from enemy shrapnel wounds. While healing at Fort Ord, a grunt in the bed next to me said, "Hey Madigan, you hear about the concert coming to Monterey this weekend? It's called Monterey Pop. Acts include Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, Mamas and Papas, Otis Redding, and many more." And I used to work at fairgrounds, and I know how to sneak us in. So that's a very fun first two chapters. A few chapters also about my first encounter with true, genuine hippies, and my light duty pushing a library cart from bed to bed in the hospital. Also chapters on my experience as a drill sergeant and eventual departure from the Army in August 68 with honorable discharge.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you for your time and good luck on the next book. And hopefully there